be strong.
This show is a culmination, a collaboration to a show that I did in the past. And the essence of that show was entitled, Have the Modern Woman Been Empowered to Be Depowered? The purpose of that show was to more or less show a correlation that most modern women have more or less been victims of self-sabotage. And the essence of that self-sabotage is due to a condition called unaccountability. As you know, a lot of women have been unaccountable. You see the virtues of unaccountability in the media. You see it a lot of times in families and marriages and relationships. And because of that unaccountability, there have been a percentage of our women that have had more or less an inflated ego or view of themselves. And because of that overinflation, they have more or less, how can I say it, given a false sense of hope by a condition that we use in this line of work called simps. And as you know, simps are normally an acronym that I created. And most simps are unconscious of what they're doing because they more or less supplement irrational male principles. The unconscious simp supplements irrational male principles. And because of that sublimation to the female ego, you have an inflated view. You have women that have an inflated view of themselves. But before I start this expose, I want to send my love and my condolences to those women that are rare in this modern milieu called America. And there's a percentage of women and some of our sisters that more or less see the condition themselves. And they have been more or less incensed or more or less disturbed by the behaviors that we see in some of these modern women. And some of our sisters have been so disturbed to the point, and also some of our women, that they have been more or less vocal about the incessant and negative behavior of some modern women. You know, you can't really go any place now, whether it be Facebook or whether it be Instagram, where you see more or less pictures of women, mostly. And there are some men that do it, but mostly women. They often are taking pictures with filters. They look like they're in a state of trance. That they are queens. But what is a queen without a crown? Because in a truest sense of the matter, a woman can't be a queen unless she has a king. Now, she can become a queen by succession, but in essence, a woman is a queen because she has been anointed or more or less under the authority of a king, unless she becomes a queen through royal succession or is given the title through a monarchy, or more or less her husband has passed away. But in the generous case of the sense, a woman is a queen because she has been anointed by a king. And a queen is a woman that's been covered. But you got a lot of women in modern America there that call themselves queens, but they have not been covered by a king. And because of that uncovering, they have a psychopathology called delusion. Because a delusion in the clinical sense is more or less when there is evidence to the contrary, and the person that more or less thinks the evidence is there continue to deny that evidence. That's a delusion. And see, these delusions are being fed, once again, by unconscious simps. And I said it earlier that a simp is someone that more or less supplements irrational male principles. And so I'm going to expound on that unconscious simp at some point. If anybody more or less uses terminologies, please give me credit for it, because this is an acronym that I created myself. Now, I didn't create the word simp, but I did create the acronym in my own words. So if you use it, please cite me for credit. Now listen, I've said in the past that Eve was a woman that more or less lost her place, trying to find her place, never to find her place again. And I did this as a culmination to a series because I've seen the excessive narcissism of a lot of modern women. And I said in that expose, empowered to be depowered, that when Eve lost herself, trying to find herself, never to find herself again, and because of that, she became empowered to be depowered, because she was more or less jousting for power. And that's the problem or the predicament of a lot of modern women. They want not only the power in the relationship, but they want to deem themselves superior to their men. And what continues to inflate this, what I call lack of an equilibrium, once again, is the simp. Now listen, you don't have to believe in the tenets of theology. That's irrelevant. You might not believe in the tenets of the Bible or the tenets of theology. But to those that do believe in it, Eve was a vibrant woman when she was under the guidance of her husband. But what's happened to a lot of men now, men have not learned how to lead, or they have not been more or less been given examples how to lead, because they've been raised in single parent homes, which in essence more or less does not espouse masculine principles. Now I know and I get it. There are some men that were raised by single moms, the few that were, and those women more or less deferred to the uncles, or more or less deferred to other people in their families. But for every rule, there's an exception to that rule. And because of that, and because of the lack of masculine authority in families, a lot of boys more or less espouse principles that can be sustainable not only to themselves, but also sustainable to their self-development and also to their self-esteem. Listen to this. As a clinical therapist, in a relationship, everything should be copacetic, or everything should be at an equilibrium. But in behavior modification, the person that more or less defers to the next person has more power. And because of that more or less sense of more power, then the other person that concedes to power more or less defers or more or less denies themselves. But to continue the elaboration or the examination on what is a queen without a crown, let's explore who this man was by the name of Narcissus. Narcissus was a man that more or less formulated the current word that we have in the DSM-5 now called narcissistic personality disorder. And while narcissistic personality disorder is mostly seen in men, and it's more or less a byproduct of people that lack empathy, you see a lot of women now that have, if they're not bona fide narcissistic, they have narcissistic personality traits. And those narcissistic personality traits is often the self-aggrandizement of themselves. It is the pontification that they are great. And just like Narcissus was a man that looked at himself in the river or the pond or the spring. He became mesmerized by what he saw to the point that he became immobile. And that's what's happening to a lot of women today. They're continuing to self-sabotage themselves in relationships because they feel that they are better than the men that they are dealing with. And what's happened, you have an inflated market where women are more or less gravitating to the top 5 or 10% men, leaving a good pool of great men unaccounted. And because of this disequilibrium, you have a bunch of men that have become frustrated. And they're more or less become more or less distressed at the pain and the agony of being seen as less than. Because these are the same men that maybe 40 or 50 or 60 years ago were good and average men that got women. So what happens to a queen without a crown? What happens to a queen without a crown? Because this so-called queen is causing havoc in our communities. This so-called queen has been left unaccountable in the modern church. This so-called queen puts her own self above the needs of others, which in essence is a lack of empathy. Because empathy seeks to understand the pain and the hurt of someone else. Then, as we continue to explore what happens to a queen without a crown, a woman is at her best when she is covered. The beer virus showed that because a lot of women were vulnerable. And that false sense of entitlement or that false sense of superiority came down to a crashing halt because they had to understand that they were not as great as they thought they were. You see, when men and women are in unison together, one can send 1,000 to flight, but two can send 10,000 into flight. And there's beauty in unity because when a man and a woman come together, if you believe in the tradition of family, then you more or less have the power of interdependence. Men and women were more or less optimized to be synchronized. They were more or less men and women more or less are optimized to be synchronized. And when they work together in that synchronicity, they can do a lot more. But the beer virus did something that we saw or we never thought we would see. And a lot of these so-called queens lost their status, they lost their position, they became paralyzed, and they had to come to the grips that they were not as great as they thought they were. And see, while we tend to build these so-called queens, and while we tend to give them more or less the adulation that they don't deserve, a lot of men, more or less, are to blame. Because leadership starts with men. Leadership starts with the man because women are going to always look up to you. They're going to always blame you for behaviors even though you didn't do anything to be blamed for that behavior, just like Adam. Adam was blamed for the behavior of Eve. And just like Eve became a victim of what I call delusions by magical thinking. Because once again, as I said earlier, a delusion is the belief that something is there, even though the evidence says to the contrary. I've coined a term called delusion by the way of magical thinking. Because magical thinking more or less preposes that a condition or a byproduct came about because that person is special. And see, that delusion by magical thinking has led to a condition called entitlement, where a lot of women feel that they are entitled to your money. They feel that they are entitled to your time. They feel like they are entitled to your body and your resources. And sadly, there are a lot of young men and older men that capitulate to the whims of these entitled women because they do not have principles that are self-sustaining. And listen, I submit every man is guilty to some degree of sin, even me myself. But for the most part, I've always been a strong and a masculine man. And I speak this with conviction because I've seen a lot of brokenness in not only men, but my passion is for a lot of young men of all ethnic groups, white, black, Asian, Hispanic. But because the black man in America has been the muse of society, I speak this as a special proclamation to you. So I say it again, what is a queen without a crown? Because a queen without a crown is left to the devices of her own demise and her own self. A queen without a crown is left to the vices of a divided community. A queen without a crown is left without the covering of her husband. And as I said it earlier, The man thinks of theology has said it clearly as it relates to the book of Corinthians, if you believe in the Bible. God is above man. Christ is above man as well. Man is above woman. And because of that order, kids have stability and they have balance, and therefore they have hope. But see, when you take away the natural order of things, God above Christ, Christ above man, man above woman, you don't have order, you have what's called chaos. And when you look at the matriarchy that's been created mostly in the black community, you have a lot of chaos. And a lot of this chaos has started more or less back around the 1965 Lyndon B. Johnson administration. And it's more or less proliferated to the cesspool that you have now. And also because of a woman that more or less tried to pontificate being a queen without a crown, there's another condition called solipsism. Solipsism is that self is all that's known to exist. Most women have not been trained to be wives. Most women don't come into a relationship wanting to serve so that the man can turn around and serve her as well. But the modern woman comes into relationships, many, not all, as I said earlier, thank God for the good women that does exist. But they come into relationships wanting to be served. They come into a relationship expecting themselves to be the exemplars or being better than the men that they are dealing with. And what that condition has done is caused a lot of men to have a low self-esteem. It's caused many of them to defer their own self-worth at the expense of building up a woman that sees them as a nobody, a woman that will divorce them for half of their assets, a woman that will take them to court, and a woman that more or less have left men in such a perilous condition that some have led to suicide. So I want to challenge the woman or the modern woman in America to think that she's a queen. Because you are not a queen. Because a true queen can never be a queen unless she had the admonition or more or less the guidance of her king. And a woman becomes the best version of herself when she's able to float in her more or less translucent femininity. So therefore, I'll leave you with this. If it ain't 7, it ain't kosher. If it ain't kosher, it ain't right. And so I want to challenge some of these young men and also older men to stand firm on your masculine principles. Don't let these delusional women, by the way of magical thinking, go around thinking that they are queens. Because a true queen is a woman that knows what her role and design is. A true queen is willing to submit to masculine authority as the man submits to her. Because men submit when we submit in different ways. Men submit by loving, providing, protecting, and dying for their women. Women submit by honoring, obeying, and respecting their men. Because submission is a duality similar to a clinical term, well, not a clinical term, but a scientific term called a symbiosis or a symbiotic relationship. So I want the men that are hearing this, I want you to internalize this, because from a clinical lens, you are empowering these so-called women that have been more or less empowered, and because of their delusions, they have been depowered. So when you sacrifice your important masculine principles in the future, I want you to ask yourself the question, how am I contributing to this psychopathology? So once again, I want you to sit back and enjoy this more or less elaboration on what happens to a queen without a crown. And as I said earlier, remember this: if it ain't 7, it ain't kosher. And if it ain't kosher, it ain't right. I want you to enjoy this day. And I'm going to salute this to the brotherhood, as many have been broken by the chains of despair in the past. But today is your victory. Today is your time. Today is your season. As the time is now. Be well.
Be strong.